Hello my YouTube friends, it's been a very long time again, but I'm back, and a lot of what has been keeping me away is finally done. So here I am, and hopefully I've got a lot of ideas for videos that I've wanted to do over the last couple of months or so, so hopefully I'll be more able to get around to doing those now that all this remodeling and such that we had to do after our move is finally complete. Now, with that said, the reason I'm doing this video today is because I've had a special request from Sadie Dammit to speak on the subject of, well, let's just say psychics and such, and the biblicality, shall we say, of such things. So she asked my opinion about that, so I'm going to offer her the best answer I can. We'll be looking at scriptures. I'll be giving you my thoughts a bit about what they say and how it applies to what we see in our modern world. So immediately, the first thing we're going to do is go back and look at the Bible in the Old Testament. In the books of the law, we'll be looking primarily at Deuteronomy and Leviticus and a little bit from Isaiah, to get a sense of what God feels about these things. We're going to start in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18, starting with verse 9, and it says this: "When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or his daughter as an offering, anyone who practices divination, or tells fortunes, or interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or a charmer, or a medium, or a necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God. For these nations which you are about to dispossess listen to fortune tellers and diviners, but as for you, the Lord your God has not allowed you to do this." Now that's pretty clear cut and covers a wide variety of subjects concerning psychic phenomena. So, but the important thing, even though this is quite detailed and very specific, one thing we really want to look for when God says something is, does God repeat himself? Because oftentimes when God is really, really firm about something, when something's an abomination like this says, God does tend to repeat himself on the subject, and we do find that as we move to the book of Leviticus. In chapter 19, verse 31, we read, "Do not turn to mediums or necromancers. Do not seek them out, and so make yourselves unclean by them. I am the Lord your God." Now some of you may not be sure what the word necromancers is. I'll just read a little definition for you here. It's a form of divination in which the practitioner seeks to summon operative spirits or spirits of divination for multiple reasons, from spiritual protection to wisdom. So let's move on to chapter 20 in the book of Leviticus, verse 6, which says, "If a person turns to mediums and necromancers, whoring after them, I will set my face against that person and will cut him off from among his people." Moving on to verse 27, same book and chapter, "A man or woman who is a medium or a necromancer shall surely be put to death. They shall be stoned with stones, their blood shall be upon them." And then in Isaiah chapter 8, verses 19 through 20 say this: "And when they say to you, inquire of the mediums and necromancers who chirp and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Should they inquire of the dead on behalf of the living? To the teaching and to the testimony. If they will not speak according to this word, it is because they have no dawn. Now, saying somebody has no dawn is basically the same thing as saying they have no light in them. And light, of course, comes from God. And now we're going to look at Isaiah chapter 41, where we find God challenging other nations to prove that their gods are gods. And we're going to consider the basis on which God himself says is the test. Isaiah 41, starting with verse 21, says, "Set forth your case, says the Lord. Bring your proofs, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring them, and tell us what is to happen. Tell us the former things, what they are, that we may consider them, that we may know their outcome. Or declare to us the things to come. Tell us what is to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Do good, or do harm, that we may be dismayed and terrified. Behold, you are nothing, and your work is less than nothing. An abomination is he who chooses you." In chapter 42, it also says, starting in verse 8, "I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols. Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare before they spring forth. I tell you of them." So here we see this challenge that God has given to the gods of the other nations, that if you really are gods, well, first he says, go back into the past and tell us of all the things that have been. This is something we see God himself do, well, in the book of Job, for instance. He goes back and tells of things that occurred in creation, things that date far back before the memory of any people that ever lived. God goes back and reveals mysteries about creation. Having said that, God then makes the case that they should tell him what things are yet to come. Because, well, God does that throughout the Bible. We have all kinds of prophecy spoken to us about things that are yet to come. And many things that were spoken of in the Old Testament did come to pass. And that was one of the tests of a true prophet. And you have to keep in mind, prophets speak from God himself. And that's the difference between a fortune teller and a prophet. We read in 2 Peter that prophets speak from God as they're carried along by the Holy Spirit. So this is something quite different than what a psychic would be, or a medium, or somebody who contacts the dead. It's a whole different ball game. Prophets are speaking directly from God. They are essentially God's mouthpiece. And the test of a true prophet was whether or not the things that he predicted came to pass. If he predicted things that did not truly come to pass, he could be put to death for being a false prophet. So this is the test that God puts forth on his very deity. I can prove my deity, he says, because I can tell you what's been, and I can tell you what's yet to come. And he offers that test to the gods of other nations. And they, of course, could not pass that test. And we're going to look at some other things that are going to show us how the psychics don't really pass that test either. Now, one of the things that people who believe in psychic phenomena as being a godly practice, or at least a valid and true practice, is that they point to the situation with King Saul when he sought out the witch of Endor, or the medium of Endor, and the fact that he went to her wanting to consult Samuel, and that Samuel actually appeared and told Saul some things. And they point to that and go, well, see here, he went and consulted a medium, and this medium actually did bring up the spirit of Samuel, and it was real. But there's much more to that story than what perhaps appears on the surface, so we're going to take a closer look at it. This story is found in 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 13 through 14. Here's what it says. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams, or by Urim, or by prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servants said to him, Behold, there is a medium at Endor. So Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night, and he said, Divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you. The woman said to him, Surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death? But Saul swore to her by the Lord, As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Then the woman said, Whom shall I bring up for you? He said, Bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman said to Saul, Why have you deceived me? You are Saul. The king said to her, Do not be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a god coming up out of the earth. He said to her, What is his appearance? And she said, An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. Now, as we see, and this goes on to say that basically Samuel asked him, Why did you bring me up? And Samuel ended up rebuking Saul and telling him why his end was coming about, why the Lord was turning against him. But the important point here for this is that we're asking the question, okay, so why, if we're calling into question the validity of this practice, why did Samuel actually show up? And the important thing that I think to look at here is what happens. Let's go over it again real quick. Then the woman said, Who shall I bring up for you? He said, Bring up Samuel for me. Now, that's the end of it. We don't hear anything else. We don't hear that the woman did anything. We don't hear that anything else happened. The next thing we hear is, when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman said to Saul, Why have you deceived me? You are Saul. So, it's pretty clear in the text as we read it that the woman was shocked to actually see Samuel come up. And it seems that, well, according to the text anyway, she didn't even do anything. He told her who to bring up, and boom, Samuel appeared. And so it's pretty clear, and he came up, with a rebuke for Saul, obviously. And the woman was shocked to see him. She was terrified. She was deathly afraid. And, she wasn't expecting to actually see Samuel turn up. I think that's pretty clear from the text. She was shocked. She was terrified. She was afraid. Samuel turned up and immediately interacted with Saul and dealt with him. He didn't even deal with the woman in any way, shape, or form. Neither did she do anything by the text to bring him up. He just came up. sent from God, obviously, because why? Why would God do this? Why would God send the spirit of Samuel to go and rebuke Saul? Because Saul had done an evil thing. He stopped seeking God, which he did on many occasions. He, rather than seek God for the right things to do, he came up with his own ideas. And, and here too, he stopped seeking God and went to seek the advice of a medium. And this is the way that God dealt with him. He sent Samuel to rebuke him. And so we really aren't seeing here any kind of support for the validity of mediums and fortune tellers and psychics and that kind of thing. We're seeing a prime example of an evil person doing an evil thing, being rebuked for it. Now, seeing this, we're actually going to go on now to 1 Chronicles chapter 10, because 1 Chronicles chapter 10 tells us about Saul dying, and it tells us why Saul died. It gives us the exact reason that Saul had to die. In verse 13 it starts off saying, "So Saul died for his breach of faith. He broke faith with the Lord, and that he did not keep the command of the Lord, and also consulted a medium, seeking guidance. He did not seek guidance from the Lord, therefore the Lord put him to death, and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse." So the fact that Saul sought advice from a medium instead of the Lord was one of two primary reasons named for why Saul had to die. So no support for psychics there, no support for mediums, no support for trying to make contact with the dead. So the end result of all this is simply God lends no support for psychic phenomena. He speaks clearly against it, both in the law and in the books of history. We see that he acts against it. There is clearly just no biblical support for these practices. And having said all that, I'm going to say one final thing. Let's consider Harry Houdini. Harry Houdini once sought out a medium to try and contact someone who was dead. And he discovered in the process that this person was a fraud. Now, Harry Houdini was considered, and is considered today, the master of magicians. And sleight of hand, deception, whatever, was an art that he used to his advantage for what he did. But he also spent a great deal of his life exposing the misdeeds of those who truly sought to deceive people into thinking they had powers they did not have. He often exposed psychics, mediums, and the like, and had a great deal of success doing so. He had an uncanny knack for being able to figure out their deceptions and prove them false. And things don't change much, people are out there doing what they do, claiming to be psychics, claiming to be able to contact the dead. And by and large, I believe most of it's simply arts of deception. Some of it may actually be witchcraft, where people are actually trying to contact the dead and such, and end up contacting evil spirits who are messing with both their minds and the minds of those who seek their advice. And so I believe the Bible's pretty clear about these things, and that's my final word on the subject. If you want to challenge me about it, and I'm not talking about you, Sadie, because I know that's not your interest, but if there's others out there who want to challenge me and say, they believe the Bible supports it, Well, just as God said to the idols of other nations, prove it. But you take care.